Formula Rossa may have been the coaster that put Abu Dhabi's Ferrari World on the map, but you can make a compelling argument that Flying Aces is actually the park's best coaster. Flying Aces is an Intamin mega coaster in the mold of Skyrush. Same track, same cable lift, and same wing seating. But it also has some key differences from Skyrush, and I'm going to point these out throughout the course of this review. Ferrari World is an indoor amusement park, but Flying Aces is one of the few rides that extends outside the dome and into the Abu Dhabi desert. And the experience begins with an elaborately themed queue through an army barrack. I wish I had pictures of this queue, but Flying Aces has a very strict no loose article policy. It's done in the honor system, but everything must go in a free locker before entering the queue, just like Universal. Now let's talk about the most hated aspect of Skyrush, the restraints. It's why Skyrush has the nickname Thigh Crush. At first glance, they look identical in Flying Aces, but there's a very subtle difference. The underside of the restraint is contoured. This results in a far more comfortable ride experience. Compare that to Skyrush, where the restraint has this rectangular bar on the underside that contacts your thigh. I also have a big piece of advice for you. Make sure you're in the back row. I originally rode Flying Aces in the front and came off incredibly underwhelmed. This coaster had barely any airtime and just felt slow, which is weird to say for a coaster with a top speed of 75 miles per hour. But then I rode it in the back, and I didn't ride it anywhere else. I got the wild ride I had hoped for. It was just different than what I expected. Some of you may be licking your chops that this coaster is an ejector airtime machine like Skyrush, and I'm gonna pump the brakes right now. It's not Skyrush. This is its own unique coaster. There are certainly moments of ejector airtime, but what stands out most with this coaster are those crazy laterals. You know that Stengel dive on Skyrush when it feels like you're going to flip over sideways into the creek? Well, Flying Aces does that at least a half dozen times. These laterals are accentuated by how exposed the seats are, especially if you're out on one of the wings. The ride begins with one of the most disorienting lift hills in the world. As I mentioned earlier, Ferrari World is indoors, and the queue and station for Flying Aces is quite dark, so you're blinded when you re-emerge into the sunlight. And you're completely thrown off by how unnaturally fast the cable lift is. You rocket atop the 207-foot lift hill in just under 10 seconds. To put in perspective how fast this lift is, it's 4 to 5 seconds faster than Skyrush. And Lightning Rod, a coaster just as tall as Flying Aces with a launched lift hill, takes only 2 less seconds to reach the top. And for that reason, you are absolutely thrown over the first drop. You get some incredible ejector airtime. It's one of the better first drops out there. And in a flash, Flying Aces will then switch from the insane negative Gs to insane positive Gs. Like Skyrush, the pullout is very tight and banked, but it's even more extreme in Flying Aces. It pulls a whopping 5 Gs. I grade out on every single ride. And that leads into the massive non-inverting loop. I was stunned this element had no airtime, but the lateral whip in this element, particularly in the back row, is incredible. This is the first instance of those crazy laterals I mentioned earlier. That is followed by a relatively mundane turnaround, and that leads me to my next criticism of Flying Aces, the pacing. Whereas Skyrush is pedal to the metal from start to finish, Flying Aces has a lot of dead spots. There are a lot of drawn-out transitions or turns in between these elements that make the ride feel way slower than it actually is. I'd say half the elements hit, and the other half fall flat in their face. But those elements that do hit are incredible, in the back row at least. An example of this is the fantastic speed hill that follows this turnaround. You are launched into the stratosphere, and this is one element that doesn't matter where you sit. The next 2 hills feel like camelbacks on a B&M Hyper. You crest them a bit too slowly in the front to get any airtime, but back row riders get some nice floater airtime. And while I like floater airtime, I was a bit disappointed it didn't deliver the sustained ejector airtime like the camelbacks on Skyrush or Superman the Ride. After a speed hill that does absolutely nothing, there's a quick bank turn that gives you a pinch of laterals, but it's just an appetizer for the S-hill that follows. This S-hill is wild. There's no airtime here, but the laterals are great. You are violently whipped to the side. After yet another lackluster turnaround, Flying Aces glides through this heartline roll. It is a fantastic inversion. It delivers a copious amount of hang time. It feels like time is standing still because of how drawn out this element is. This is actually one of the few elements on the ride that benefits by being drawn out. That's followed by Flying Ace's final trick, this tiny S-hill. It looks all cute and innocent, but this may be the wildest element on the entire ride. It feels like the floor completely drops out from you, and the ride tries to flip you over into the sand. No matter how many times I rode Flying Aces, I could not keep my hands up for this element. It caught me off guard every time. And needless to say, it's an exciting way to end the ride. So what do I rank Flying Aces? That's a complicated question. In the front, I'd probably give the ride a 6 out of 10. It's just really underwhelming up there. But in the back, Flying Aces is significantly better. I'd say the experience back there is closer to a 9 out of 10. And since you can request your row, I'll ultimately settle on an 8.5 out of 10. Flying Aces isn't perfect. It definitely has some pacing issues, and it doesn't have as much airtime as other mega coasters. But the best moments on Flying Aces, namely that drop, non-inverting loop, heartline roll, and S-hills, feel completely out of control. Have you ridden Flying Aces, or is this coaster on your bucket list? I'd love to hear your thoughts about the ride below. Subscribe for more content, and thank you for listening.